Ian Foxall. I'm an architect, but I also am part of the Edge, which is a built environment think tank. For those who haven't come across us before, we've been going since 1996 and see our sort of primary goal as bringing different parts of the construction sector, particularly the professional parts, together to act on those things that have to be done across disciplines and across the sector. And this includes issues like sustainability, professionalism, and so on. Um, the This webinar is about the competence framework for sustainability, or in its longer title, competence frameworks for the built environment, core criteria for sustainability competence, code of practice. I won't be saying that very much. The way this webinar will work, I'll run through various contextual issues, discuss competence and competence frameworks, the need for one for sustainability, and then look at the objectives and outcomes anticipated from the framework. I'll then look at the framework in a bit more detail and the way it's made up, before going into some of the core competence categories in greater detail. Then looking at the scope and application of the framework, some of the responses we've had in the consultation process, and finally to conclude. So in the context relates back to the CIC's Carbon Zero, the Professional Institutions Climate Action Plan, which the Edge wrote for the CIC. And the plan is broken down into 10 work streams. And this fits into work stream 10 on competence, ethics, and advocacy, which the Edge chaired and coordinated. And it relates specifically to Action H, which was that all professional institutions were to take increased and coordinated measures to ensure competence in low energy design and management amongst their membership, both on entry and at regular intervals throughout their careers. And it has to be said that when the Carbon Zero plan was written, it was written for COP26 in Glasgow. So it does focus fairly heavily on issues around carbon and climate change. But since then, the work of the CIC's Climate Change Committee has been equally on the biodiversity emergency as the climate change emergency. So you assume when carbon is mentioned in the plan that it actually is a wider topic around sustainability as well. And the Climate Action Plan has a series of mainly institutional signatories who've agreed to follow the actions in it. There are about 40 of these, including many of the big institutions, but also some of the smaller bodies and institutions in the industry. And it is those we're obviously primarily interested in communicating this to. So on competence, competence is a word that has come up hugely in recent time. This has been very much impacted by the Grenfell tragedy and the various inquiries and reports written after that, both in Dame Judith Hackett's several reports, and also the final report of the Grenfell Tower inquiry, both of which have looked at the built environment professions and have come to the conclusion that we're not hugely competent, or in Grenfell Tower inquiries terms, the level of competence in the construction industry are generally low. And that's obviously not only the professionals within the sector, but everybody acting within it. And the Building Safety Act of 2022 puts requirements for competence into law when it says that any person carrying out building work or any design work must have, where the person is an individual, the skills, knowledge, experience, and behaviors necessary. Uh, that doesn't refer purely or in any sense to just building safety. It is competence across the board, even though it sits in the Building Safety Act. That's also been transposed into the building regulations. So this is a general requirement for competence for everyone participating in the built environment sector. And the way this generally is organized and sort of policed in some senses is through competency frameworks. A competency framework is a direct framework spelling out the competencies required for any individual within a sector or a role or a particular discipline. And they've been common across the world for many different things, including for the civil service in this case, but also from organizations like the OECD. And our own industry has a fair number of these as well. UK spec that defines the standard for professional engineering competence has been around for a long time. It's now its fourth edition. And more recent competence frameworks include those for the Association of Project Management, the Chartered Association of Building Engineers, engineers responsible for the Global Responsibility Competency Compass. And this is beginning to creep into other areas, including places like administration of architects' competence. So this it's a growing area, and it's becoming a familiar one as well. But competence is urgently required for sustainability, both to deal with the climate change emergency and the biodiversity emergency. I don't think anyone probably needs telling that these are very serious topics and are going to have a huge impact on the work of the built environment sector and what we do and what we achieve and how we perform. The seventh carbon budget published 2 weeks ago by the Climate Change Committee in the UK points out that the built environment sector is now the second largest emitting sector for carbon in the UK. And by 2050, that has to be brought down to absolute zero. So this is not something we've been doing particularly well at in recent time. Most of the gains in reducing carbon have come from places like the electricity sector rather than anything else. So we have a job to do. Equally, we need to deal with biodiversity. This graph, of course, is the other way up, even though the lines are pointing down, and they're pointing down because we've been losing species and general biodiversity year on year, and we need to turn this around so that we stop doing that. So a competence framework also emerged from the work that the Edge did 10 years ago, encourage on the future of professionalism in the UK and anywhere else. And one of the recommendations made by Paul Morrell, who chaired the commission, was that on climate change, the various parts of the industry should begin uh, to work cross-institutionally on policy positions and publish cross-disciplinary recommended behaviours for members on designing for mitigation and adaptation in the face of climate change. So this very much falls into that activity, and this is very much part of the Edge's work programme on this. And it has to be said that the sector as a whole has been responding admirably to the climate crisis, less so possibly to the biodiversity crisis. And it has produced a large number of initiatives and reports and how to respond recommendations. And it's also been working, particularly in the last 10 years, on a whole sector of a whole number of cross-sector initiatives, including the Built Environment Carbon Database, the UK Net Zero Carbon Building Standards, collaborations like the Climate Framework or LETI, or indeed the work on Part Z. But there is a question here. Where has been the work on competence? There's plenty of reports, recommendations, guidelines, standards, targets even, that suggest what we have to do and how we have to do it. There has been very little on what competence we need, what skills we need, and what behaviours are required to make ourselves competent to actually deliver on these things. And in many ways, this standard attempts to be the beginning of filling that gap. So competency frameworks in the built environment. This work has followed on from the competence work done following Grenfell on building safety. And this is a part of a series within the British Standards Institution's work streams on competence for the built environment. And it started with BS 8670 Part 1, which is on building safety. In train at the moment is Part 2 on construction product competence. And it's very much anticipated that this will be the third part of this series of frameworks for competence. And just as the Part 1, it's intended that this might spawn a whole series of subsidiary standards for particular disciplines, particular activities within the built environment. So 8670 has led to frameworks for competence for principal designers, principal contractors, management of safety, and so on. And it's intended that the competence framework for sustainability will do similar things for different disciplines within the sector. So what are the objectives of this competence framework? The intention is that it should be a consensus-based approach. So everyone ideally should have a means of discussing what should be in it and how it should develop and so on. And it should be open in that sense. It should have a map of the overall skills, knowledge, experience, and behaviours, known as SCEB, required for addressing the challenges of the climate and nature emergency in our sector. So really, it gives an overview for any part of the sector who is interested in developing frameworks for sustainability for their particular discipline or roles within their discipline. And that map should be broad enough to encompass the entire sector, not just not just the professional sector or the construction sector, but any trade, any manufacturer, any client body that is interested in understanding the competence required. It should have a degree of consistency with other competence frameworks that exist out there, so particularly building safety, but any others, so that they become part of a generalized family with flow across from one to another, because it's very much seen that if you can achieve a safe built environment, you're likely to achieve a sustainable one. The same requirements exist between the two of paying attention to detail, doing things well, understanding why you're doing things, and so on. And these they're not in any sense at odds with each other, but they work together to create a better built environment that will achieve a whole series of different positive outcomes. It should deliver a set of core competence criteria for sustainability, but also a series of stages or levels of expertise or understanding of knowledge, of skills and behavior up through those criteria. It should have a shared and consistent language and structure across the sector, very much so that different parts of the sector can use that language and be understood by other parts of the sector. There is a tendency for words to mean different things in different parts of our sector, and this is really very much intended to establish a baseline for what many of these things might mean. And it does need to be applicable to that wide range of roles and disciplines through the sector. And this ultimately should be leading to a development of a whole series of different frameworks for different disciplines, different roles, and so on, which will be produced by those bodies who know those disciplines well, or have some sort of role in their administration. And the obvious final outcome is that we should end up with a more competent sector, a sector that knows what it's doing, knows how to achieve goals that it sets for itself and are set for it by government and in law and by wider society. Really, so that we can begin to actually say we are able to do what we promise we will do, and we can stand by that. In general, there are other anticipated outcomes that would come from this. There should be greater awareness across the sector of what different disciplines are doing, and also the ability to communicate and understand what's going on in different parts of the sector. There should be, in any sort of different individual discipline, both breadth but also greater depth that fits into an overall sort of jigsaw within the industry. So specialization is very much supported, so long as it sees how it works within the wider industry, and particularly how it interlocks with a series of other roles, minimizing both gaps between those roles, but also not overlapping unduly and wastefully, so you get a whole series of different disciplines doing effectively the same job, but in coming from a different direction. It's likely to lead to that whole series of sector-specific frameworks for various key roles, particularly roles that we are interested in relying on, and those that are promising things like equitable and just transitions within the industry and within wider building performance. And it's likely that it will need to come with a process of validation and then revalidation at set intervals, including the provision of guidance, education, and training, a monitoring and oversight process able to feed back into the system, some sort of monitoring arrangements, whether by institutions or third parties or whoever. And this not only should lead to that sort of confidence that we have a competent industry, but it should enable people like employers and clients to specify and assess that they have got that full range of competence that they require for doing their projects. It has an ethical underpinning on the basis that we all have a responsibility for health, life, but the natural environment, equity, and the public good across the industry. It takes a broad view of what's required. It's not specific to any particular discipline or any particular building type or so on. It assumes things like honesty, integrity, openness and transparency, and a respect for the law. And generally, it expects accuracy and rigor, collaboration between different disciplines. It really doesn't work if disciplines don't collaborate with each other, sharing their expertise. And it needs it requires a degree of responsibility for direction and conduct and so on, as well as evaluation, reflecting, and greater learning. Underpinning it is the notion of SCEB, now a familiar term in not only in competence frameworks, but across many parts of society, that we should offer skill, and that skill needs to come with knowledge based on and contributed to by experience. But the fourth part of SCEB behavior is possibly the area that has never been sort of described hugely within our sector. And this is very important to make a great deal more of. Other disciplines, other sectors have always focused much more on the nature of behavior within the what they do. And within our sector, in order to deliver on sustainability, behavior is going to be absolutely critical. Just an aside, it talks about built environment in its title, and built environment in this case is a broader term than just buildings, and this is partly in order to make it work within a greater family of British standards. So it uses the definition of built environment in PAS 2080, which is carbon management in buildings and infrastructure, and the phrase built environment covers the collection of human or made or induced physical objects located in a particular area or region, and it includes not only the buildings, but the external works and landscaped areas around them, infrastructure, and the products of construction works within an area. So although it may not say include something like a forest, it will definitely include huge areas of open air, natural, the natural environment that go to support the places we live and work and so on. Now, in developing the standard, the framework, we very much used the BSI's development process for one of their standards, starting with the in-depth research is what's required, working with an advisory panel, taking it out to review before finalizing the draft and then publishing it. And that's been from the inception of this work a 2-year process to get to where we are now, with the publication of a final report. And the consultation process, has taken us through a whole series of industry consultations, draft of documents, advisory panel meetings to go through it in greater depth, line by line reading and discussion of the contents of the framework before issuing a final consultation document for public consultation, which we had a 3-month public consultation in the autumn of last year. Following that, it was revised and then it was published 2 weeks ago. And the principal sort of early means of discussing and consulting on the framework was through diagrams. And there's a series of diagrams coming up in the slides that followed that show in part the development of the thinking around the framework before a final diagram was settled on, which is in the standard itself. And the advisory panel came from across the industry, from professional bodies, construction companies, various sort of academic groups, and so on, and was a very broad discussion from experts across the industry, which hugely added to the development of the framework. And in terms of the core categories, as you've seen sort of from the diagrams, it gradually settled into 5 broad areas labeled conveniently all with a P as potential, people, process, projects, and performance. And within that, there are a total of 18 sort of subcategories that we hope cover the whole sort of breadth of sustainability requirements for the built environment sector. It took a while to sort of to reach exactly this set of core categories, but we haven't yet found something that doesn't fit somewhere within all of this. And then there's a series of levels or stages for dealing with these various categories. So we start off with recognize. So people at least have a recognition that there are issues in this area, and that comes with 3 internal rungs of awareness, appreciation, and then understanding. Next up, there's you go up to the ability to analyze that category, and above that to begin to apply the lessons, the guidance, and that again has 3 rungs of synthesis, adaptation, and evaluation. And that leads up to the 4th stage, which is actually achieving results, achieving compliance, meeting guidance levels, meeting best practice levels, and so on. So you're achieving the targets that you're setting yourself. And finally, at the top level, you are helping to develop and advance solutions, approaches. You're communicating back to peers about what is possible, what can be done. You're publishing case studies and so on. So you're contributing back to the process, and expanding the collection of possible ways forward with good evidence to back it up. And this ultimately led to the diagram that is in the framework report. So we have our 18 core categories horizontally, and then the 5 stages sort of going vertically. And within each one of those sort of boxes that sit between them, there is a description of what's in it within the standard. So that adding up to 90 different descriptions. And these look like this. I'm not going to go through all of them. I think that would take us a huge amount of time, and you can read this in the report. But this is really just to explore how they work. On the left-hand side of each one of these is what's a requirement for the criteria. And then on the right-hand side, there is the scope of that, which is not necessarily fully inclusive or exclusive, but is a good indication of what should be in that competency area. So this is the first table within the framework. The core competence sits under the potential sector, and this one focuses on natural systems, number 1. It starts off with recognizing the role of the natural and nature-based systems, and plays out those 3 runs within recognize. Then going down, we need to be not only to recognize, be able to analyze the impact of deploying and protecting natural systems. We then go up to the next stage, not only to understand, but be able to apply, protect, and enhance natural systems. And again, with the 3 internal rungs of that. Above that, we need to be able to achieve compliance with legislation, meet standards and targets covering natural systems and ecological services. And then at the highest level, we're able to develop and advance the understanding and use of natural and nature-based systems to provide services in the built environment. And if I then just run through 4 more of these, not in that degree of depth. So this one is number 6 on education, training, and literacy, and it does a similar thing of going through those 5 rungs and what you need to achieve in that to achieve competence. Number 9 on finance and risk. You're recognizing the role. First, you're able to carry out analysis of project finance and risk. You're able to apply effective and appropriate mitigation and adaptation solutions, and so on. And then going up to the next level, you're able to understand and achieve compliance with legislation and meet agreed standards and targets. And finally, sort of the sort of top end, you're able to help develop and advance finance and risk management assessments and procedures to achieve more sustainable outcomes. Under projects, this is on land use and planning. Again, going through those 5 stages to develop what should be a competence within land use and planning, and then taking it up stage by stage. And finally, under performance, how you're monitoring, providing information and feedback against those five levels. And that all then sits within the whole competence framework. And as an individual role is described, you begin to assign levels for competence for each one of these. This is for someone who's relatively senior, who's wants to contribute at a high level. So they understand and are able to analyze natural systems. They have a good grip on the resources required for that, and can apply the lessons learned. They're achieving the goals they're setting themselves for energy and carbon, and they've decided that they're going to make a great high level of social impact, including advancing the way their practice actually sort of achieves that, and really achieving all the goals on harms and solutions. On sort of people, they want to make sure that they're achieving high educational standards. They're advancing the way behavior is happening, and they've got a high level of team working understanding. But they don't expect to be able to analyze necessarily finance and risk to any great level. They're content that they can get a good analysis and understanding of what's happening, but wouldn't be able to actually implement it themselves. Whereas for practice, they are keen to achieve that, and they have the ability to use a whole series of different tools and technologies to achieve that. On projects, they're content generally that they understand a whole series of different aspects of this, but they're not experts in that. So that for land use and planning, they're capable of analysis. For external spaces, they may feel they need to apply a certain number of standard approaches. And again, on infrastructure, they just feel the need that they can recognize that various things exist and how they work. But they are experts and want to advance the practice within buildings and interiors. The project monitoring, they're keen to do that well, but again, with resilience and emergency response, that's really not their expertise, even though they're capable of dealing with it in some degree. And of course, there are completely different sets of profiles that exist for all sorts of different roles within the industry. And it would be the job of individual framework developers to spell out exactly what these were for any particular role within their sector, and also how you might advance in your overall career through a series of different profiles within against the framework. So the standard is intended for use by persons, but mainly for use by organizations with the responsibility for the development of and maintenance of sector-specific competence frameworks. But it's also relevant to people like commissioning clients who would be assembling a team and would want to make sure that they had a team that neither sort of was overlapping in its expertise and its competence at a high level, but also didn't have any kind of yawning gaps where they needed things to happen. And there are a wide range of potential roles within the sector, some laid down by statute, others less precise, that could benefit from the framework. So it's intended for use in the development and evaluation of individual sector-specific frameworks, but it's not really intended for use as a framework against which individuals themselves can be directly assessed. And it covers technical and non-technical roles right across the industry for really any body that is supervising and defining the roles of competent individuals. And it's very much there as a standard to be mapped against, so that any organization developing a set of competence framework for its own members or others can use the framework as to map against, to make sure that they're not they're covering the whole sector in an adequate way, and that they're also fitting in with other sectors, sort of their neighbours and so on. And it also sets out the organisational requirements for bodies going through this process, so that they need to provide adequate detail. They need to provide accessible information. You can't set a standard if you don't tell those who are obliged to follow competence requirements what those standards are, and so on. And there will be necessarily procedures for monitoring competence, including validation and revalidation, setting out, and including within that a need to set out the requirements for those who are doing that, the assessing, registering, and monitoring competence, so that they are people with the right degree of expertise. And ultimately, there's also going to be a need for procedures for sanctioning those who fail to meet competence requirements in the industry. Clearly, those procedures already exist in parts of the sector, but they will need to become clearer and possibly more widespread. So it has been now through all these stages, and the consultation process threw up a whole series of useful commentaries and recommendations within the report, which in its final iteration were dealt with, we hope, coherently and fully, although sometimes the consultation responses contradicted each other. So we've been working through them in a degree of detail. And it was launched on the 27th of February, that's 2 weeks ago, and is freely available to anyone who wants to download and use it, or particularly anybody who wants to do that. At this point, it will also be handed over to the British Standards Institute for development as a formal British standard. It's a seed document at the moment. It's been through a process that they recognise, but they would still need, again, to take it through their own internal and external processes. So it may be a year or more before it becomes anything. It goes up to the sort of the next level. But in that time, it's a fully available document and will carry on being available to anyone who wants to use it. And we hope that it will be taken up by bodies across the industry, but also, overseas and anywhere really that is interested in using it. Thank you. And any questions?
Hi, Simon. We do have a few questions. Shall I read them out for you?
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got one from Tom Crane. As well as climate, carbon, and biodiversity, how does the framework address climate justice and responsible sourcing of materials and technologies regarding rights abuses in supply chains?
So just on the social aspect of this, the criteria 4 is on social impact, that affects anyone within um, the wider society who is impacted by the activities of the built environment sector. And that includes the wider supply chain. It includes users of buildings, people within living within the built environment, and so on. So, as a framework, it doesn't go into sort of great detail. It flags up that these are issues of concern um, for any built environment actor who is claiming to be competent, that they need to be sure that they are responding to this. Equally, core criteria 2 is on resources. And again, there is a responsibility um, for competent actors to make sure that they understand what they're doing when they use resources, both physical resources, mind resources, but also natural resources and human and animal resources and so on. It is very much intended to be a broad framework for these concerns to be fitted into and to find appropriate places. And then for anyone setting a framework for their own particular discipline, to make sure that they're covering in adequate depth. And the reason for its breadth is to make sure that they can see that they need to deal with social impact, um, and and they can't simply ignore it because they don't regard it as being part of their area of responsibility. It's something that they both need to recognize is a requirement for their own members, but equally to recognize that there are others within aligned disciplines whose skills and abilities, knowledge, experience, behaviors are worked with in order to create a collaborative built environment sector. Any others from?
Yep. So we've got Tristan Olivier. Great iteration of the two of TPs, to which can be added a six, perpetuity, the consideration of everything over time. Does
Yeah,
that
hi Tristan. I hope that comes in any case, particularly in those issues that deal with the wider requirements of the industry. I quite like perpetuity, but I think you'll find that it is a cross-cutting issue that goes across all the other sectors spelt out at the moment. We are aiming for sustainability, and sustainability above all means that things can keep on going.
We have one from Rebecca Lovelace. Many thanks for this very helpful overview. I see that there is a focus on people and wonder if this includes social sustainability and equity, diversity, and inclusion. If not, is there an opportunity to collaborate to incorporate this wider sustainability focus?
Um, it does. There is a difference between people within the sector, the team it was largely responsible for, and that sits within people. The social impact side fits within potential, and particularly into the core theme on social impact. So again, really sort of repeating that this is a very important part of being competent, that you are able to offer leadership and example and recognize the impact of what you do. You can't simply operate in a vacuum or without a wider team of people working around you, doing the necessary sort of roles within the environment that are required to deliver sustainable projects.
Brilliant. Steve Everton, he said, bravo, at least we can now get professionals to consider their competence and not just ignore it as a health and safety subject as the most important challenge for us, more so than H and safety. I applaud this. As someone who's been writing competence systems for many years and recently for Building Safety Acts, it is easy to get very bureaucratic, understandably. The challenge is whether these systems do make a difference, i.e. with 8,670 documents, would they have stopped Grenfell? A similar consideration could be given here in getting the balance right. Do you think the framework will make the difference, or that the emphasis will make professionals better at their jobs in such an important area?
Thank you very much for that. I very much hope it will make a difference. I mean, I think the first thing to say in that is that it is important that we spread the idea of competence beyond building safety, and see these other elements of competence as being part of a wider competence, yeah, understanding in the sector, and part of our general responsibility as not only professionals but all sorts of players within the sector. As to whether it makes a difference, obviously this relates to the degree of take-up it achieves. The reason for going down the British Standard route was very much to maximize that take-up, to ensure that it wasn't simply about one discipline within the sector, or that it was led by a particular discipline that was trying to make it sort of voice heard again over others. But this was a very much a cross-sectoral requirement, and that equally applies to part one of 8670, that it's not going to stop something like Grenfell on its own, but it may well seed the requirements for competence within the industry that would do that, and that particularly relates to how we behave as an industry, and that we show greater responsibility for the outcome of our work, and make sure that we have a follow through and a sense of responsibility to the public interest that has again only been building up again recently, within the last decade or so, as people understand how we need to play our part in society as professionals and all sorts of other participants.
Brilliant. So we've got a few more questions, but I think as we've got 5 minutes left, I will do one more, and then I'm afraid it'll be time to log off. But like many other standards regarding competency that have become paramount recently, for a practice, a lot of work is now being carried out to review and assess individual competencies, including company competency. Is there a thought that this proposed process can be merged into the assessments regarding all of the fields of competency as a single entity rather than another separate system to be assessed?
Yes, I hope so. I mean, I think I made sort of clear our sort of aim that this was took part as it's part of as part of a family of competency strategies. Ideally, these at some point would be wrapped up into one competence framework rather than sort of a series of individual ones, and they are deliberately written in similar language, using similar concepts, using a similar structure to make sure that they can actually work together and be understood as one rather than as a series of separate things with separate languages and so on. I think it will take a bit of time to settle down. The idea of writing competence frameworks for our sector is actually still quite new, and people are exploring precisely how they can work. But there will be a point at which it should be possible to say this is actually what a framework for the entire sector looks like, and therefore where a particular discipline fits into that and how it relates to its neighbouring disciplines in providing a sort of a relatively seamless set of individual disciplines across the sector that work together in collaboration to achieve projects and so on.
Brilliant. I'm just going to finish on, it's not a question, but it's a statement from Denson. And they said, "This is amazing. I just wanted to say thank you. Teamwork will be key to getting everyone involved."
Thank you for that. Please go out and tell others that this exists and it's there to be used. It's be used by anyone who's interested in this subject. There's no reason to wait for anyone else to get on board with this, and encourage others to use it as well. The more we have a consensus over what needs to be done and a consistent approach to this across the sector, the better for everybody involved, as well as the outcomes of our projects and the way that we work, and with its impact on the greater world, society and the planet.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much, Simon, for presenting this to us. Thank you for everyone who attended. We will share the recording afterwards and hopefully a copy of the slides as well. And obviously, if you have any further questions or want to have any further dialogue on the framework, then please do get in touch. But thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you from me.